Let's talk about the moment it actually happens, the moment the narcissist realizes they've lost. And I want to be very clear here because people often imagine this as some dramatic scene. They picture an argument, a confrontation, a breakup speech, or finally standing up to them in a way that leaves them stunned. But that's not how this works. In fact, when the narcissist truly realizes they've lost, it's usually quiet, almost anticlimactic. There's no explosion, no confession, no apology. What changes is something far more unsettling for them: you. For a long time, the narcissist relied on a predictable pattern. They said something hurtful, and you explained yourself. They crossed a boundary, and you bent it. They blamed you, and you defended yourself. They withdrew, and you chased. This rhythm was their sense of control. It's how they regulated their fragile sense of self. They didn't need you to be happy, they needed you to be responsive. Emotional reactions, pain, anger, confusion, tears, those were signs that they still mattered, that they still had access to you. And then one day, that access quietly disappears. You stop over-explaining. You stop trying to convince them to understand. You stop reacting the way you used to. And what's important here is that you may not even be doing this intentionally at first. Often it comes from exhaustion. You're tired of the circular conversations, tired of the gaslighting, tired of feeling like no matter what you say, it never lands. So you pull back, not dramatically, not loudly, but consistently. And that consistency is what triggers the narcissist's alarm system. At first, they don't fully register it. They assume you're having a mood. They assume you'll come back into line. After all, you always have before. But then the pattern doesn't reset. They provoke, and you don't rise to it. They criticize, and you don't scramble to prove your worth. They test a boundary, and instead of folding, you hold it. That's when something shifts internally for them. Because control for a narcissist isn't optional, it's psychological oxygen. And suddenly that oxygen feels thinner. This is where fear enters the picture. Not fear in the way we typically imagine it, but a deep, destabilizing sense of threat. The narcissist begins to feel that something is slipping away and they don't know how to grab it. They may not say it out loud, but internally the thought is something like, why isn't this working anymore? And that question terrifies them. Because if their usual strategies don't work on you, then what does that say about them? What's crucial to understand is that this moment has very little to do with insight or self-awareness. They're not suddenly reflecting on their behavior and realizing they hurt you. That kind of accountability is extremely rare in narcissistic dynamics. Instead, what they're feeling is the loss of leverage, the loss of emotional control. And to them, that feels like losing power, relevance, and safety all at once. You might notice subtle changes when this happens. They may repeat the same tactics with more intensity, almost as if turning up the volume will make you respond. Or they may grow oddly quiet, watching you more closely, trying to figure out what changed. Some become irritated or contemptuous, accusing you of being cold, different, or selfish. What they're really saying is, you're no longer playing the role I assigned you. And that's deeply unsettling for them. From your side, this can feel confusing. You might think, I'm not doing anything special, I'm just tired, or I'm just finally protecting my peace. And that's exactly the point. Your shift doesn't require an announcement. You don't need to declare independence. The narcissist realizes they've lost not because you made a grand exit, but because you stopped offering your emotional energy on demand. And once that happens, the dynamic can never fully return to what it was. This is also why trying to win against a narcissist through confrontation often backfires. When you confront them aggressively, they still feel engaged. They still feel significant. They still feel powerful enough to affect you. But when you disengage, when you stop feeding the cycle, you remove the very thing they depend on. And that's when the loss becomes real. There's another layer here that's important to name. For many narcissists, control isn't just about dominance over others, it's how they manage their own internal chaos. Your reactions help them regulate their self-esteem. When those reactions disappear, they're left alone with feelings they don't know how to handle: insecurity, emptiness, shame. And instead of looking inward, they experience that discomfort as being caused by you. which is why this realization can come with anger, blame, or panic rather than reflection. You, meanwhile, may start to feel something very different. There's often a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for what you hoped the relationship could be, and relief that you're no longer trapped in the emotional tug-of-war. And even though it may not feel triumphant, this is the turning point. Because the narcissist's power was never inherent, it was borrowed from your emotional availability. And once you stop lending it, the illusion collapses. So when people ask, "How do I know when the narcissist realizes I've won?" the answer isn't found in their words. It's found in the shift, the subtle, uncomfortable realization that you are no longer easily pulled, no longer predictable, no longer controlled. That's the moment they feel it, not as defeat in a competitive sense, but as loss of access. And for a narcissist, that is the deepest loss of all. Because when you stop reacting, stop explaining, and stop handing over your emotional energy, you don't just step out of the cycle, you end it. After that initial loss of control settles in, something else begins to happen. And this is where the narcissist starts to unravel internally. What once looked like confidence, certainty, and even superiority begins to crack. Because narcissistic confidence isn't real confidence. It's borrowed. It's built on predictable reactions from the people around them. And when you stop reacting the way you used to, that borrowed confidence has nowhere to land. What replaces it is confusion. You'll often notice this before they ever say anything. Their behavior becomes inconsistent. They don't quite know which version of themselves to use with you anymore. The charm feels forced. The criticism feels misplaced. The silence feels longer. It's as if they're cycling through old scripts, waiting for one of them to work. And when none of them do, the confusion deepens. Because narcissists rely on patterns. They study people. They learn what provokes, what soothes, what pulls someone back into orbit. And suddenly, you're no longer following the pattern they memorized. This is deeply destabilizing for them. They may ask indirect questions, not because they want to understand you, but because they're trying to regain their footing. Are you mad at me? Why are you acting different? What's going on with you lately? On the surface, it can sound like concern, but underneath, it's anxiety. They're scanning for clues, trying to figure out which button to push to restore the old dynamic. And when you don't offer those clues, they feel lost. What's important to understand here is that confusion for a narcissist is not a neutral state, it's threatening. They need to feel one step ahead emotionally. They need to believe they can predict outcomes. When that ability disappears, it shakes their sense of superiority. They start to second-guess themselves, not in a reflective way, but in a frantic way. They may replay past interactions, trying to identify where they lost control. And instead of arriving at insight, they often land in suspicion. This is where projection often intensifies. If they don't understand what's happening inside you, they assume it must be something external. They may accuse you of being influenced by someone else. They might suggest you're changing in a negative way. They may even imply you're being manipulative. The irony, of course, is that your behavior is simply more stable, more boundaried, more self-directed. But to them, stability without submission feels like a threat. You may also notice them oscillating between extremes. One moment they're overly nice, almost performative in their kindness. The next they're cold or dismissive. This emotional whiplash isn't strategic, it's confusion in motion. They're throwing out different energies to see what lands. They don't know whether to pull you closer or push you away. And that uncertainty erodes the image they work so hard to maintain. From your side, this can be unsettling. You might feel like you're walking on unfamiliar ground, wondering if you're imagining the shift. But this is often the stage where people start doubting themselves again, thinking, maybe I should explain, maybe I should reassure them, maybe I should go back to how things were. And this is exactly why this phase is so important. Because the confusion you're witnessing is evidence that the dynamic is changing, and change in narcissistic systems is deeply uncomfortable. Another thing that happens during this phase is that the narcissist's narrative begins to wobble. For a long time, they told themselves a story about you, who you were, what you'd tolerate, how much you needed them. That story justified their behavior, but now, your actions no longer fit the script. And instead of revising the story in a healthy way, they often double down on distortions. They may reinterpret your calm as cruelty, your distance as betrayal, your boundaries as punishment. This is also why you may notice an increase in testing behaviors. They might bring up old conflicts. They might make subtle digs. They might flirt with someone, LSE, withdraw affection, or suddenly become too busy. These aren't random acts. They're attempts to provoke a reaction, to confirm that they still matter, that they still have influence. And when those attempts fail, the confusion becomes more pronounced. What's powerful here is that you don't have to do anything to maintain this shift. You don't need to be colder. You don't need to be harsher. You simply stay consistent. You respond when it's appropriate. You don't over-explain. You don't rush to repair their discomfort. And that steadiness becomes the mirror they can't tolerate looking into, because it reflects something they've been trying to avoid. They are not in control of other people's internal worlds. This is often the point where the narcissist starts to feel exposed. Not because you've called them out, but because their usual performance isn't landing. The audience they relied on is no longer clapping. And without that feedback, they don't know who to be. That confusion can show up as irritability, sarcasm, or even mockery. But underneath it is a deep sense of disorientation. And here's the part that matters most for you. This confusion is not your responsibility to fix. It's not your job to restore their clarity by shrinking yourself again. In fact, every time you resist the urge to soothe their discomfort, you strengthen your own clarity. You begin to trust your perceptions. You begin to realize that the fog you lived in for so long wasn't about your inadequate. It was about the system you were in. So when the narcissist starts to look unsure, unsettled, or inconsistent, don't mistake that for weakness you need to manage. It's simply the absence of the control they once relied on, and as uncomfortable as it may feel to witness, it's also a sign that you're no longer living inside their script, because the moment their confidence turns into confusion is the moment you step fully into your own. When confusion sets in and they realize their old playbook isn't working anymore, the narcissist doesn't suddenly become reflective or remorseful. Instead, something far more predictable happens. Desperation creeps in. And desperation in narcissistic dynamics is never quiet. It's reactive. It's urgent. It's messy. This is the stage where the behavior often intensifies, not because they care more, but because they're starting to feel the panic of losing their emotional supply. You might notice a sudden shift in tone. Someone who was distant becomes attentive overnight. Someone who withheld affection starts offering it generously. Compliments return. Apologies appear, often vague, often poorly timed. You might hear things like, "I didn't realize how much you meant to me," or "I think we've both made mistakes." And it can feel disorienting because part of you has wanted this acknowledgement for a long time. But it's important to understand what's really happening here. These moments are not rooted in insight, they're rooted in fear. This is what people often refer to as hoovering, the attempt to pull you back into the dynamic once the narcissist senses they're losing you. It can look like nostalgia, promises of change, sudden vulnerability. They may reference shared memories, inside jokes, or moments when you felt close. Not because they're processing the relationship, but because they're trying to reestablish emotional access. They're throwing out a familiar hook, hoping you'll bite. If that doesn't work, the strategy may shift. Love can turn into guilt. You might hear about how hard things have been for them, how misunderstood they feel, how no one else really gets them the way you do. This isn't connection. It's pressure. It's an attempt to reassign you to your old role as emotional caretaker. And if you hesitate, if you don't immediately step back in, the desperation escalates. For some narcissists, this escalation takes the form of anger. The warmth disappears, replaced by irritation or contempt. They may accuse you of abandoning them, of being ungrateful, of changing for the worse. They might dredge up past mistakes or twist the narrative to position themselves as the injured party. This sudden shift can be jarring, but it serves a purpose. Anger is another way to provoke engagement. If they can't pull you back with affection, they'll try to push you into reacting with defense or guilt. Others may lean into victimhood. They may talk about how alone they feel, how much they're struggling, how unfair life E has been to them, and again, this can tug at your empathy, especially if you're someone who has spent years attuned to their emotional states. But here's the critical distinction. Genuine vulnerability invites mutual understanding, narcissistic vulnerability demands rescue. The moment you step in to save them, the old power dynamic snaps back into place. You may also notice more subtle desperation tactics. Suddenly, they're everywhere you are, liking your posts, commenting on your life, reaching out just to check in, or they may create situations designed to provoke jealousy, casually mentioning someone new, exaggerating attention they're receiving. These behaviors are meant to test whether they still matter to you, whether they can still stir something inside you. And when those tests don't land, the anxiety deepens. What's important during this phase is recognizing that these behaviors are not signs of growth. They are signs of dysregulation. The narcissist is scrambling to restore equilibrium, and for them, equilibrium means control. They are not trying to build something new, they are trying to resurrect something old. And the old system only worked when you were over-functioning emotionally. From your perspective, this stage can be the hardest. This is where doubt creeps in. You may wonder if you're being too harsh, too distant, too unforgiving. You may think, maybe this time is different, or maybe I should give them one more chance. And that internal conflict makes sense. You're responding to intermittent reinforcement, the very pattern that kept you stuck before. The difference now is awareness. One of the most powerful things you can do here is nothing dramatic. You don't need to confront every tactic. You don't need to explain why you're not engaging. You simply maintain your boundaries. You respond calmly, briefly, or not at all when appropriate. You don't reward desperation with emotional access. And this consistency sends a message louder than any argument ever could. The old rules no longer apply. As the desperation continues, you may notice something else shift. The narcissist's behavior becomes less polished. The charm slips. The manipulation becomes more obvious. That's because desperation erodes strategy. When they were confident, they could be subtle. Now they're reacting, and that reactivity reveals the underlying insecurity that was always there. It's also worth noting that this phase can be brief or prolonged, depending on the individual and the situation. Some narcissists escalate quickly and then disengage when they realize they can't regain control. Others linger, cycling through tactics over time. What remains constant is this: the more you resist being pulled back in, the clearer it becomes that their behavior is about them, not you. This is not the stage where you convince them of anything. It's the stage where you prove, through your actions, that you're no longer available for the role they assigned you. That proof doesn't come from confrontation, it comes from consistency. Because when their desperation fails to hook you, it marks the moment they realize the door they once walked through so easily is finally closed. After the confusion, after the desperation, something far more threatening settles in for the narcissist, and that is your detachment, not your anger, not your sadness, not even your disappointment. Detachment. This is the point where they begin to sense that they're no longer the center of your emotional universe, and that realization hits deeper than any confrontation ever could. Because anger still means you care. Detachment means you're free. At first, detachment can look deceptively simple. You're calmer, you respond less, you don't explain yourself the way you used to. You're no longer trying to make them understand, approve, or validate your experience. From the outside, it might even look like you've gone numb. But this isn't numbness. This is regulation. This is what happens when your nervous system finally stops bracing for impact. For the narcissist, this shift is deeply unsettling. They've always relied on emotional intensity to anchor the relationship. Whether that intensity was positive or negative didn't matter. What mattered was that it flowed through them. They could provoke it, redirect it, and use it to feel powerful. Detachment disrupts that entirely. There's no current to grab onto anymore. You may notice that your presence starts to feel different to them. Conversations feel flatter. Interactions feel shorter. You're not volunteering personal details. You're not seeking reassurance. And perhaps most unsettling of all, you're no longer trying to resolve every moment of tension. This absence of urgency is not something narcissists know how to interpret. To them, unresolved tension is supposed to pull you closer. When it doesn't, they feel exposed. This is often when they start to accuse you of being cold, distant, or unkind. They may say you've changed, that you're not the same person anymore. And in a way, they're right. You are different. But not in the way they imply. You haven't become less caring, you've become more discerning. You've stopped giving unlimited emotional access to someone who misused it. Detachment also removes something else the narcissist depends on, your availability for emotional labor. You're no longer processing their feelings for them. You're no longer translating their behavior into something you can tolerate. You're no longer smoothing over their discomfort. And without that invisible work being done on their behalf, the relationship feels hollow to them. They may not understand why, but they feel the loss. What makes detachment so powerful is that it's not performative. You're not doing it to prove a point. You're doing it because you've reached clarity. And clarity is quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't defend itself. It simply is. That steadiness is deeply threatening to some, one who relies on chaos to stay in control. At this stage, the narcissist may try to provoke you back into engagement. They might say something cutting. They might dismiss your experience. They might suddenly bring up old wounds or create new ones. And when those attempts don't land, when you don't react the way you once did, they feel a kind of existential panic. Because if they can't reach you emotionally, then who are they in this dynamic? This is where people often misunderstand what winning actually looks like. It doesn't look like dominance. It doesn't look like revenge. It looks like peace. And peace is intolerable to someone who needs drama to feel alive. Your calm becomes a mirror they don't want to look into, because it reflects the emptiness they've been avoiding. Detachment also marks the moment when you stop centering them in your inner world. You stop replaying conversations. You stop wondering what you should have said differently. You stop measuring your worth by their reactions. And as that inner shift takes place, the narcissist feels the external consequence of it. They no longer occupy the same psychological space in your life. And that displacement is the true loss. For many narcissists, this is the point where they realize that the version of you they controlled is gone. They may still have access to your physical presence, your co-parenting logistics, or shared responsibilities, but the emotional leverage is gone. And without that leverage, their influence shrinks dramatically. It's also important to recognize that detachment doesn't mean indifference to your values. You can still be kind. You can still be civil. You can still act with integrity. Detachment simply means you're no longer investing emotionally where there is no reciprocity. And that boundary is something the narcissist cannot override. From your side, this phase often comes with a strange sense of grief. You may realize just how much energy you poured into managing the relationship. You may feel the weight of what you carried for so long. But alongside that, grief is something new, relief. The absence of constant emotional vigilance creates space for you to return to yourself, and that return is what makes detachment so threatening. Because when you reclaim your emotional autonomy, the narcissist loses their foothold. They can no longer define you, provoke you, or pull you into their internal chaos. They may still attempt it, but it no longer works the same way. So if you were wondering whether detachment is too much or too cold, understand this: detachment is not cruelty, it's clarity. And clarity is what finally breaks the cycle. Because the moment you become unreachable emotionally is the moment their power over you truly ends. Once detachment takes root, something irreversible happens in the dynamic. This is the part people often underestimate, the point where the power shift becomes permanent. Up until now, there may have been moments of distance before, moments where you pulled back, tried to leave, or threatened to set boundaries. But this is different. This isn't a pause or a protest. This is a fundamental rewiring of how you relate to them, and they can feel it. For a narcissist, power has never come from strength or stability. It's come from leverage, from knowing how to pull your strings, how to activate your guilt, your hope, your fear. When those strings go slack, they experience a kind of internal collapse. They may still posture, they may still perform, but underneath, They know something has changed that they can't undo. You will often notice that their attempts to regain control start to feel hollow. The same words don't carry the same weight. The same threats don't provoke the same urgency. The same charm doesn't feel convincing. It's not because they've changed, it's because you have. You're no longer responding from the same place of self-doubt or emotional dependency. And without that, their tactics lose their effectiveness. This is where many narcissists become acutely aware of loss of dominance. They might try to reassert authority through rigid rules, criticism, or control over logistics. They may nitpick, micromanage, or suddenly care deeply about things they once ignored. These behaviors are attempts to reclaim power in more concrete ways, because the emotional avenues are closed. And while this can be frustrating, it's also revealing. It shows just how much their sense of control depended on your internal compliance. From your perspective, this phase often brings clarity. You start to see the relationship more accurately, without the emotional fog. Patterns that once felt confusing now make sense. You realize how often you were pulled into reacting, fixing, or apologizing for things that were never yours to carry. And with that realization comes a quiet confidence. Not arrogance, not defiance, just a grounded sense of self-trust. This is also the point where many people notice that even if the narcissist tries to re-enter their life later, it doesn't land the same way. The conversations feel superficial. The emotional hooks don't catch. There's a sense that you're standing on different ground now, and that difference is permanent. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unknow what you've learned about yourself. For the narcissist, this permanence is deeply unsettling. They often live in cycles: idealization, devaluation, reconciliation. They expect the wheel to keep turning. When it doesn't, they feel disoriented. They may test you months or even years later, reaching out as if nothing happened, assuming the old dynamic will still be there. And when it isn't, they're confronted with a reality they don't know how to manage. What's important to understand is that this permanent shift doesn't require cutting off all contact, though sometimes that's necessary. It's about internal boundaries. You can share space, responsibilities, even conversations. But the emotional hierarchy has changed. They're no longer above you. They're not the reference point for your worth or decisions. And that internal equality or even neutrality is something they can't tolerate. This is often when the narcissist's behavior becomes more transparent to others. Without your participation in the old dynamic, the imbalance becomes visible. They may come across as controlling, volatile, or insecure in ways they once masked. And while it can be validating to see others notice, the real victory isn't external validation. It's your internal freedom. You may also notice that your life begins to expand, not in dramatic ways at first, but in subtle ones. You have more mental space, more emotional energy. You start reconnecting with parts of yourself that were quieted or sidelined, and as you do, the narcissist's presence in your mind continues to shrink. That shrinking is the true sign of a permanent power shift. There's also a grief that can accompany this phase, not because you miss the abuse, but because you recognize how much you invested in something that couldn't meet you. That grief is part of healing. And unlike the chaos of the past, this grief moves you forward. It doesn't trap you in cycles of hope and disappointment. For the narcissist, the permanence of this shift often leads to one of two responses. They either disengage and look for control elsewhere, or they persist in low-level attempts to reassert dominance. But either way, the original dynamic is gone. The version of you that was susceptible to their manipulation no longer exists. And that loss is something they have to carry. So when people ask whether a narcissist knows when they've truly lost, the answer is yes, but not because you told them. They know because nothing works the way it used to. The power they once felt is gone, and no amount of effort brings it back. Because when the balance shifts inside you, it shifts forever, and that is a loss they can't recover from. When the power shift is complete and no longer reversible, something else begins to happen, something quieter, deeper, and far more confronting for the narcissist. Your healing starts to stand in direct contrast to their inner world. And this is the part people rarely talk about, because it isn't dramatic and it isn't visible on the surface, but it's profound. Your growth becomes a mirror they cannot avoid, And what it reflects is the emptiness they've spent their lives trying not to feel. For a long time, the narcissist was able to define you. They decided who you were. In the relationship, too sensitive, too needy, too demanding, not enough, too much. That narrative served a purpose. It allowed them to stay superior and avoid looking at themselves. But once you step out of that narrative, once you begin trusting yourself, regulating your emotions, and rebuilding your sense of identity, their version of you starts to fall apart. And when it does, so does the story they've been telling themselves. This is where the realization becomes deeply uncomfortable for them. Because your healing doesn't attack them. It doesn't accuse them. It doesn't demand accountability. It simply exists. And in existing, it exposes something they can't tolerate. You didn't need them to become whole. In fact, you became whole once their influence diminished. That truth lands like a quiet verdict. You may notice that as you grow calmer, clearer, and more grounded, the narcissist seems more agitated, more restless, or more hollow. That's not a coincidence. Narcissistic systems rely on external validation to maintain internal stability. When you stop providing that validation, when you stop reflecting back admiration, fear, or emotional dependence, they're left alone with themselves. And for many narcissists, that inner space is deeply uncomfortable. What makes this stage so powerful is that you're no longer trying to prove anything. You're not trying to show them how well you're doing. You're not seeking closure or recognition. You're simply living differently. And that difference speaks volumes. Your peace becomes evidence that the chaos wasn't inherent to you. It was contextual. It belonged to the dynamic, not your personality. This is often when narcissists attempt to rewrite history. They may minimize the relationship, dismiss your growth, or claim they were never affected. They might say things like, "You were always like this," or "I didn't do anything to you." These statements aren't about truth. They're about self-protection, because acknowledging your healing would require acknowledging their role in your pain, and that's something they're deeply motivated to avoid. At the same time, they may feel a strange pull toward you, not because they want connection, but because your stability highlights their instability. Your boundaries highlight their lack of them. Your self-trust highlights their fragility. And instead of using that contrast as an opportunity for growth, they often experience it as a threat. That's why they may become dismissive, mocking, or contemptuous toward your progress. It's easier to devalue what they can't access than to confront what it reveals. From your perspective, this stage can feel surprisingly quiet. There's no big confrontation, no final showdown, just a growing sense that you've moved into a different chapter. You may realize that you're no longer thinking about them the way you used to. Their opinions don't carry the same weight. Their moods don't dictate your day. And that absence of preoccupation is the clearest sign of healing. What's also important here is understanding that this isn't about punishment. Your healing isn't something you're doing to them. It's something you're doing for yourself. Any discomfort they feel in response to that is not your responsibility. It's the natural consequence of a system that depended on your emotional sacrifice to function. This is where many people finally let go of the idea of revenge. Not because they've forgiven or forgotten, but because they no longer need the narcissist to suffer in order to feel whole. They've reclaimed their power internally. And internal power doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't even need closure. For the narcissist, this is often the final loss. Not the loss of the relationship, but the loss of relevance in your inner world. They may still talk about you. They may still distort the story, but they're no longer shaping your identity. And that's the emptiness they're left with. The realization that they are no longer central, no longer needed, no longer reflected. And here's the part I want to be very clear about. You don't heal to teach them a lesson. You heal because you deserve peace. Any clarity or discomfort that arises for them as a result is incidental. The real outcome is that you return to yourself, more grounded, more self-trusting, more whole than you were before. So when people ask what finally happens when the narcissist realizes you've won, the answer isn't collapse or remorse. It's something quieter and more enduring. You move forward, they stay the same. And that contrast tells the entire story, because the greatest consequence for someone who tried to control you is watching you thrive without them, and knowing they no longer matter,